This is a new book that really has something like 30 years of ministry experience behind it, different parts of Asia and different parts of North America. And this one, unlike my own doctoral research, which again is much more brainy and academic, this one is very practical. Now these cost $15 on Amazon, but I happen to know the publisher, so I get them for $5 a piece. So if you want one of these, go ahead and let me know. And if anyone from the local mosque would like one, go ahead and share this with them. It's not written for a Muslim audience, but Christians, we have nothing to hide, right? There's no secret strategy or anything like that. So this is Sharing Jesus with Muslims in America. Okay. And we've got like a humming sound. Do we know where that's from?
Air conditioner.
Oh, okay. As long as it's not me, I'm fine with it. Great. So tonight we're going to talk about Muhammad, who really is the foundation of everything that is in Islam. People look at Christianity and Jesus really is the central figure of Christianity. But when you actually look at Scripture, none of it is actually written by Jesus himself. There are the Gospels that contain relations, memoirs of different things that he taught and said and did. But he actually didn't write any of the Bible itself, personally, right? However, according to Islamic tradition, Muhammad really is the one in Islamic thought through whom the entirety of the Quran came. So Islam is really centered around the person and personality of Muhammad in a very unique way. Before we get into the lecture, I want to sort of recap what we've learned so far about Islam. Remember, we looked at the creation narrative. God says to man, I have made you so that you might know my power. The fundamental relationship between humanity and God is one of being the servants, the slaves of God. God does give authority over the cosmos, the universe, to humans. Remember that we've looked at the passage from the Quran where the angels are kind of dubious. They're like, what are you doing creating this kind of creature? He's going to make trouble. And God says, I know things that you don't know. Now, the fundamental problem in the Islamic meta-narrative, or the big Islamic story, is not that of sin, which is what we have in the Christian faith. The fundamental problem is that of ignorance. That humans are simply ignorant of God's will and of God's law. Remember, in Islam there is no original sin. In the Christian faith you have this doctrine that with the rebellion of the first humans, Adam and his wife, that somehow all of humanity becomes estranged from God. Even from the time that they are a little baby in their womb. And I gave you a technical word for this. It's called concupiscence. Islam doesn't have anything like that. Islam has a doctrine of original innocence, proclaiming that humans are fundamentally born into right relation with God. And indeed, Islam claims that it is the natural religion. So if you talk with people who were not Muslims and became Muslims, like here in Texas, oftentimes they will not call themselves converts. They will call themselves... Anybody know this?
Muslims.
Well, they will call themselves Muslims, but they will call themselves reverts, right? And if you read their testimonies or hear their stories, they will say, well, what I'm doing is I'm not going to some other religion. What I'm doing is I'm going back to the original religion and right relation with God that I was born into. I'm reverting to the Islam that I was born into. So this is the way of thinking about these things that we find in Islam. Quite different than what you're going to find in Christianity or indeed other religions. But the fundamental problem in Islam, okay, so it's not sin in the whole Christian story. We talked about this 2 weeks ago. The problem is sin, so God has to provide a sacrifice. That's the Lamb of God, Jesus, who dies on the cross, and by shedding his blood, and then being raised from the dead, he somehow reconciles humans to God. Okay? So that sin is taken care of. Now, I'm really simplifying a lot of Christian doctrine here. But the reason I'm doing this is so you can understand how nonsensical, how strange that sounds to Muslims. If you believe that you're born into a right relation with God, the idea that the Word of God becomes a human and dies on a cross to reconcile you to God, well, that is a pretty exotic, strange sounding idea, right? But the fundamental problem in Islam then is this sort of contest between the devil and God. And humans are being led astray. They're being kept away from knowing the fullness of God's will. Since humans in Islamic theology are basically good, that means that if they just have the right rules, they will be able to follow them. They will be able to follow these rules. We run into a difficulty because all of us, even if we just go to a couple of rules about right and wrong, say the 10 Commandments, we run into the difficulty that even if we know the rules in our experience in our day-to-day life, even though we know the rules, we oftentimes don't keep them. Muhammad is the solution to this problem in Islam. Now Muslims, they do believe in the other prophets, Moses, Abraham, David, Jesus. And indeed, according to Islam, God even sent revelations to some of these prophets. He sent the Torah to Moses, he sent the Psalms to David, he gave the gospel to Jesus. And these were even written down. Now, according to Islamic tradition, the text of the Bible that you and I have, we would say, well, here's the Torah, here are the Psalms, here are the Gospels. Most Muslims would say, well, those are not reliable guides. Those are not really the accurate records or the real texts that were given to those prophets. I want to be very clear, that's actually not in the Quran. Every Muslim I've ever known thinks it's in the Quran, but it's actually not. Maybe we'll get into that later. But the point is, what matters is the popular faith of Muslims. And that is that somehow those revelations that were given to the former prophets were compromised. The revelation that was given to Moses, the one given to David, the one given to Jesus, those revelations were somehow compromised or corrupted. So how is God, in the big story of Islam, going to respond to this problem, to this issue? Humans are good, they're born into right relation with God, but there's this contest between God and the devil, and some of the humans are being led astray, and humans don't know how they're supposed to live. Humans are fundamentally born good, so if they have the rules, they can follow them. Well, in the meta-narrative of Islam, the answer to this is Muhammad. Now, one of the key titles given to this person in Islam is the seal of the prophets. I want to take a moment to reflect on what that means. What does it mean to seal a document? What does that mean? What happens when you seal a document?
Close it up.
You close it up, right? What if you have a document like you have a document like a sale of property or like a degree from a university? Once you put the seal on it, what does that mean?
It's finalized.
It's official.
It's official.
It's finalized, you're sealing it up, it's official, right? So all of these different meanings help us to understand that this title, Seal of the Prophet. So again, in Islamic thought, you have all these prophets who have come, their messages have been compromised, so then you have the seal of the prophets. The final prophet, the one who is authentic, you know he's from God, the one who finalizes and concludes all the former revelations, and after him, just like a document that's sealed cannot be edited or changed, in the same way after this man's career, nothing really can be added to Revelation. And so this is what we're talking about today, Muhammad, prophet and statesman. Maybe I need to put it back here.
Let me, just a second, Doc.
Okay. Well, while we're figuring this out, I'll just talk about this a little bit. Oh, here we go. Good.
See if you can advance it now. Okay.
Okay, great. Muhammad really is an extraordinarily controversial figure. Now, I approach him not from the point of view of trying to lionize him and make him into a great hero, which is really what Muslims have to do. They are forced to do this. And I'm not approaching him, as some Christians do, and a lot of people from other religions as well, trying to just show how nasty and bad this guy is. Really, I'm trying to approach Muhammad from the point of view of a historian, try to just evaluate him as a historical figure. Okay. What is Arabia like in the 6th century? Okay, this is the context that the man is born into. He's born into Arabia in the 6th century. The first thing that I want you to know is that Christianity was a minor player all throughout the life of Muhammad. We have only a handful of explicit mentions of him having face-to-face conversations with Christians. His knowledge of the Christian faith was very secondhand. You can really tell that from the treatment of Christianity in the Quran, which is it just really shows how historically unaware of Christian doctrine he was. Paganism in Mecca is important. This is the main city where he is growing up, where his career is starting. He will later move to another place. But the main context that he's dealing with is paganism. So polytheism, there's this huge cube in the middle of the city called the Kaaba. It's still there, but it's filled, at this time, filled with idols. And indeed, the Kaaba is one of the main sources of income for the city of Mecca. And you have people from all around who are coming to engage in this pagan pilgrimage. So that's the pilgrimage in the Kaaba. Finally, we did have Arab Jews. What does that mean? We're not used to today talking about Arab Jews, right? It sounds a little bit weird. But historically, just like how we can talk about Jewish Christians in the 1st century, historically, we do that all the time, we can talk about Arab Jews. So we know that there were different groups and tribes that were in fact Arab Jews present, not so much in Mecca, but later on in Medina. That indeed was a Jewish oasis and will become a very important place for the career of the man that we're studying tonight. And what does that mean, Arab Jews? Well, we're not totally sure. Some of them may have been Jews who, as communities, had migrated down to Arabia, and then they became Arabized in terms of their culture and language, but continued to practice the Jewish religion. It could also be the case that there had been some pagan Arab tribes that had collectively actually converted to Judaism. Or it could be the case that you have a little bit of both. I personally feel that that third option is the most realistic one. So let's talk about his early life. He's born around the year 570 in Mecca. He loses both of his parents early in his life, and he's raised by extended family. He is, according to Islamic tradition, some historians have wondered if this is actually true, he is an illiterate man, right? And in the year 595, he marries Khadija. Khadija is his first wife, and during this marriage, he actually will remain monogamous, just with that one wife. Later on, this will change. Khadija is a couple of decades older than Muhammad, but they appear to have a relatively happy and content marriage. This is a very good marriage for him, in at least one way, because she is a wealthy woman and an important woman who owns a trading business. So this is helpful for him in that way. Now, according to a hadith, and let me tell you quickly what a hadith is. A hadith is a relation of an event or a saying regarding the life of Muhammad or something that he said. We'll have a couple of them later on. They usually begin with what's called the chain of attribution. I heard from this person who heard from this person who said it was related by this person, and that person is going back to someone who was an eyewitness and who was present there with Muhammad when this thing took place. And so that's the chain of attribution, and then it has the material. Some of these hadith are very short, one sentence. Some of them are quite lengthy, maybe half a page. Well, we know from a couple of hadith that he had this yearly practice of going to stay in this cave, and during this time to just be in solitude. It is in the year 610 that we have the first revelation, what according to Muslims is the first revelation that takes place. We actually have a relation of what that was like. He says, I was there, and this is my paraphrase. I can get you the actual reference if you want to read it. He says, I was there, and a force took hold of me from behind and squeezed all the air out of me. And then I heard a command that said, write. And I said, I cannot write. And then, and he's terrified, right? And then this happened again. And then it happened the third time. But the third time, he heard a different command, which was recite. And this is the beginning of the Quranic revelations according to Muslim tradition. Now that doesn't mean that the first chapter of the Quran is revealed. The Quran, like the New Testament, is not put together in chronological order. It has a different order to it. But 610, this is the beginning of his revelations at Hira, according to Islamic tradition. Recently, we just had that time of the year, right? The Muslim calendar is a lunar calendar, so it moves around. But that time of the Islamic year when people make their pilgrimage to the city of Mecca, and I think also to Medina. And one of the places that is often visited is this cave at Hira. So what happens in Mecca? What is the beginning of this man's career like? I have decided to name the lecture Muhammad, Prophet and Statesman, and that is actually based on the name of a book. It's a really good book by Montgomery Watt, who is a professor of Islamic Studies at Edinburgh University, which I like because that's where I did my PhD, although he was way before I was. And he wrote a biography of Muhammad called Prophet and Statesman. And I think that these two titles really help us to wrap our minds around the two stages of this man's career. So during these roughly the first half of his religious ministry in the city of Mecca, he really is a prophet. He doesn't have political power, military power, judicial power, which later on he will have all of those. So this time he really is a prophet in terms of how we would look at that career. Okay, just speaking a religious message, right? Not managing a state. So there are three key things. There are three key features. We could list some more, but I'll give you three of these that I think are especially important, that characterize his early message during this time that he is in Mecca. And by the way, normally when we're studying the Quran, we divide it into the Meccan surahs and the Medinan surahs, right? The Meccan ones tend to be more poetic. Literarily, they tend to be superior to the Medinan ones. The Medinan ones tend to be a lot more law. And the tone and texture of the verses changes significantly. But here we have social ethics. One of the things that Muhammad is especially concerned with in those early years in Mecca is social ethics, care for the blind, for the poor, for the widows, for the orphans, and so on. Another thing that he talks about a great deal are these ayat. Ayat is an Arabic plural feminine word. It means signs. So if you actually read the Bible in Arabic, where Jesus talks about signs and wonders, it's the same word, ayat. According to Islamic tradition, there's a doctrine that's called the ijaz. That means that the Quran is so self-evidently powerful that it can almost disable or incapacitate a person. So every verse in the Quran is called an ayah. The idea is that every single verse in the Quran is a divine miracle. Of course, you run into a difficulty when you have people who can read Arabic quite well and read the Quran and don't find it very compelling at all, right? But that is the Islamic doctrine. And then monotheism, which is called Tawheed. Now, Christians, we usually think of ourselves as being monotheists, right? But we are Trinitarian monotheists. And most Christians don't actually even know how to even basically explain what the doctrine of the Trinity is. Most Christians in America, if you ask them a couple of questions about the Trinity, there's like a whole list of heresies, and they'll usually end up with one of those heresies. So don't blame that on Muslims, that's our fault. So maybe any churches represented here can go and do a 4 to 8 week series on Trinitarian theology, right? But anyway, just so you can tell, I'm critical of everyone, right? So. Now, but Islamic monotheism is what we call monadic monotheism. So Christians have one God in 3 hypostases, and Muslims have one God in 1 hypostasis. Or hypostasis, singular, sorry. Now, let me mention a specific instance that I always get asked about. I don't think it's actually that interesting, but people always ask about this, so I decided to include it in my talk. And these are the satanic verses. Everybody knows about these, everyone who was around during the Salman Rushdie affair and so on. Well, I'm not going to talk about Rushdie's book, I'm not even interested in them, I've not read it. But the satanic verses, these actually do go back to a specific incident during the life of the prophet, during the time that he was in the city of Mecca. He was really, his heart was torn, you know. He saw his people, and they continued in their idolatry and in their polytheism. And he thought that he had received a message from the angel Gabriel. In the Quran, Muhammad never talks to God, by the way. He only talks to the angel, okay? Or he gets these revelations, these signs, these verses from the angel. They never come directly from God, okay, in the Quran. And he thinks that he's receiving these verses to recite. And so he recites, "Have you thought upon Allah, Al-Uzza, and Manat, the third, the other?" And this is actually in the Quran today. "These are the exalted cranes whose intercession is to be hoped for." So this was an effort at conciliation with his pagan Meccans, saying, you have these deities, they are not as high as Allah, the high, great God, but they are intercessors. They can help you before Allah. And this was a cause of rejoicing. Later on, we don't know exactly how much later on, he receives another message from Gabriel, ostensibly, telling him that in fact he had been deceived, and that these verses had been given to him by Satan, by the devil. And then these are canceled. So if you see up there, the ones that are in italics, that verse, that is not in the Quran today. It's replaced with a different one. So anyway, those are the satanic verses. That's really all there is to it. At one point, the man thinks that he's receiving a message from Gabriel, which of course originates from God, but he ends up being deceived. It turns out that he had been tricked by Satan, and then he has to retract those verses. In 615, you have some of the groups of Muslims who emigrate to Ethiopia. And in 619, his first wife, Khadija, dies. This is the time when he marries his child bride, Aisha, who I believe was actually his third wife. I think over the course of his whole life, he'll have either 11 or 13 wives. I don't remember the number exactly. And then 620 is the nighttime journey to Jerusalem. This is a very well-known, famous story that he is taken the Burak, which is this sort of bizarre creature, and he is taken at night all the way to Jerusalem. He touches down his foot on the Temple of the Mount, which makes it the third holiest city of Islam, and then he is brought back. Whenever I talk about Aisha, he was an aged man by this time. And she was a child bride, 6 years old when they were committed to each other, 9 years old when he actually had sexual relations with her. Everyone says, surely that can't be true. I mean, that's just so morally problematic and ethically disagreeable that people always say, how can you say that? That must be something that you're making up. So here you go, Aisha in her own words. This is from Hadith. al-Bukhari, so this is a Sahih. There is no controversy about the validity of this one. Some stories or hadith, people will say that one may not be right. This one, there's no question about it. Narrated Aisha, the Prophet engaged me when I was a girl of 6. We went to Medina and stayed at the home of Harith Khazraj. My mother, Ruman, came to me while I was playing in a swing with some of my girlfriends. She called me and I went to her, not knowing what she wanted to do to me. She caught me by the hand and made me stand at the door of the house. I was breathless then, and when my breathing became all right, she took some water and rubbed my face with it and head with it. Then she took me into the house. There in the house, I saw some Ansari women. Ansari women is one of the groups of the Muslims, who said, "Best wishes and Allah's blessing and a good luck." Then she entrusted me to them, and they prepared me for the marriage. Unexpectedly, Allah's messenger came to me in the forenoon, and my mother handed me over to him, and at that time I was a girl of 9 years of age. So, I mean, this is just an ethically problematic instance from the man's life. You know, the real problem with Islam, most Muslims that I know don't actually feel very good about this, to be frank. But they'll say, well, at that time, in that culture, that was permitted. They'll say things like, Aisha, she had reached puberty, she had menstruated, and that meant that, you know, she was physically able to do that. But I still think that this is just extraordinarily problematic on a moral level, because even if she's menstruating at 9, I mean, you can't have the psychological equipment to really deal with something like having sex with a man in his 40s or 50s.
Excuse me, sir, but that's still a practice today there, isn't it?
In Islam, Muhammad is given another title, which is Al-Insan al-Kamil. It means the perfect man, the ideal man. If you want to know what the perfect life that is agreeable to Allah looks like, you just look at Muhammad's life. How he dressed, how he wore his robe, how he wore his beard. And of course, different Muslims will look at this in different ways, right? But the overall idea is that he is the ideal man. And it's not culturally based. It's not that he was a good man for being in 6th century Arabia or 7th century Arabia. He's the ideal human being for all people at all times. And so yes, this is still practiced. Okay, so then we have the beginning of the Muslim calendar. I think this is really interesting, right? Islam, the Islamic calendar, begins with the hijrah, or the migration. It doesn't begin with the birth of Muhammad. It doesn't begin with even with the beginning of his prophetic career, right? It actually begins with this migration when the people move from Mecca to Medina. Now, Medina actually is not the historical name of this place. The actual historical name of this oasis village was Yathrib, but it is eventually given this name, Medina al-Nabi, the city of the Prophet. So this Arabic word, Medina, guess what it means? It means city, right? So today we call it Medina. At this time we have a real profound shift, and I mentioned this earlier, in terms of the kind of literature that we find in the Quran. A lot of it becomes much more intent on giving rules, because now, at this time, he has moved from only being a prophet to also being a statesman. He is in charge of governing all the affairs of the people in Medina. Even in the city of Mecca, I mean, he was persecuted. He was persecuted, people abused him, there were different plots against him and against the other Muslims, which is one of the reasons why some of the Muslims have to run off to Ethiopia, right? But here in Medina is really where we see the fullness of Islam, not just as a set of spiritual doctrines, but really as a comprehensive, complete way of life taking shape. This is where we really start to get a lot of what's called the Sharia. A lot of Americans freak out when they hear the word Sharia. But what is the Sharia? In Islam, God is aware of the ignorance of humans. They don't know how to eat, how to do inheritance law. They don't know how to take out loans and lend money, which is without interest. Between the people in Medina and the city of Mecca. And ultimately, he ends up being victorious, right? We could go into a lot of detailed history here about the battles, but I don't think they're really important for us. Certainly, Muhammad killed people. You know, he had a number of swords. We have their names. But he could also be very diplomatic. He could be, he could just negotiate with people. So violence wasn't the only thing that he used, but it was one of the many tools. What does this mean? It means he was just a political man like anyone else, right? Sometimes you have to use the sword, but if you can get it done another way, then that's fine. You know, let's talk about him like, I don't know, Alexander the Great or Napoleon or something like that, right? Okay, and then finally, Mecca is conquered. But again, conquered not in terms of like a military victory, but he is able to go into the Kaaba. And he comes to, and again, I think this is an example of shrewdness, right? He gets a revelation, and he says, you know this Kaaba? It was built by Prophet Abraham and his son. So we need to get rid of all the idols, and the Muslims will do pilgrimage to this Kaaba every year. And if you're a merchant in the city of Mecca, and that's your source of livelihood, then, okay, well, it's not the paganism, it's monotheism, but my income is still going to be steady. That's a pretty smart negotiation, I think. And then finally, in the year 632 is the death of Muhammad. Salvation. So I have a couple of just hadith that I think are interesting. A lot of Muslims that I've met over the years, and different Muslims have different positions on this, really think that Muhammad will somehow help to get them into paradise, right? Or get them back to paradise. But I think this is a fascinating hadith. When Allah revealed the verse, this is a Quranic verse, warn your nearest kinsman, Allah's apostle got up and said, O people of Quraysh, that's his own tribe, buy yourselves from the hellfire, as I cannot save you from Allah's punishment. O Bani Abd I cannot save you from Allah's punishment. So that's a closer family unit. O Safiya, the aunt of Allah's apostle, my own aunt, I cannot save you from Allah's punishment. O Fatima bint Muhammad, my own daughter, Fatima, ask me anything from my wealth, but I cannot save you from Allah's punishment. So here you have this man's really sincere, really anguished confession, right? That when it comes to the final judgment, even he has really no sway with God. I like this one, and I think this is especially appropriate for us to think about in a time when, you know, this question, what does Islamic governance look like? You know, what is the actual shape of this? Which even among Muslims is really a controversial topic. And I like this one. He who has been a ruler over 10 people will be brought shackled on the day of resurrection until the justice by which he ruled loosens his chains or tyranny brings him to destruction. So here's the idea that the way that you govern others is the way that you are going to be governed. The way that you have judged others is the same way that you will be judged. And there is a parallel there, or a similarity that we find with, of course, some Christian phrases that we're familiar with. However, he does seem to be real conflicted, especially later in his life, even about his own salvation. Now, he already said, I can't help you, daughter, aunt, immediate family. I can't help any of you with the final judgment. Look at this one. Narrated Masruq. Aisha said that a Jewess came to her and mentioned the punishment in the grave, saying to her, may Allah protect you from the punishment of the grave. Aisha then asked Allah's apostle about the punishment of the grave. He said, yes, there is punishment in the grave. Aisha added, after that, I never saw Allah's apostle but seeking refuge with Allah from the punishment in the grave in every prayer he prayed. So here he is actively going before God and saying, spare me from the punishment of the grave. So even as this ideal man, the perfect human being, according to Islamic thought, here he is worried about his own eternal salvation. What's going to happen to him? Is he going to be punished in the grave in the fire? Or is he going to be in paradise? Kenneth Cragg, this man was an Anglican bishop in Jerusalem, and he is one of my favorite Christians who writes about Islam. He writes about Islam from a critical but sympathetic tone, and I will tell you that this is really hard to find. You're going to find a lot of Christians who are very, very angry and just want to dig up all the nasty stuff they can find about Islam. I don't like that approach. That's not what I try to do. But then you're also going to find some Christians who just really want to reform Islam into sort of a secular, modern, Western thing that fits their category. And I don't think that's a sincere or respectful thing to do either. Kenneth Cragg, who wrote The Call of the Minaret, which is one of my favorite books on Islam from a Christian point of view, had this to say. Muhammad not only lacks, but specifically repudiates this metaphysical confidence in God made human. Nevertheless, the view of Muhammad implicit in the traditions, that's the insan al-kamil, amounts to some form of belief that a human particular, that is, this man's individual life, has become universal. That is, in this man's individual life, we find the template for all of life, everywhere, at all times, and all people. That all humanity may know God's will. That's the Sharia, right? But this attitude to Muhammad has never been expressed in a recognized metaphysical doctrine of his person that would undergird his tremendous ethical and legal role. What does he mean? That for Muslims to make this claim, you would hope that they'd have some sort of philosophical, metaphysical argument as to why that is. Why is it that is that man? What is it about his own life? Everything from how he ate to how he brushed his teeth to how he wore his beard. What is it about him that makes that universal for all humanity at all times normative? As often elsewhere, Islam has been content with the practical result. Some effort to think out the implications in the relationship of this exemplary Muhammad to God is long overdue. So I think this is a great challenge, issued from kindness and compassion, but with sincerity from Kenneth Cragg. So what are some of the conclusions that we can come to? Well, first of all, you have to understand that Muhammad for Muslims is the best of all humanity. I'm looking at him as a historical figure, trying to say here's some positive things, here's some questionable things, here's some negative things. That's the way I approach it. But for Muslims, I think they really can't do that. You really have to have a sort of commitment from the very beginning that this man is indeed beyond sin, so that whatever he does, it's impossible to even entertain the possibility that he did something bad, because if after his calling to prophethood he actually did something wrong, then all of Islam implodes, because he cannot be the ideal man. And indeed, I know people who have gone that route. Think of a young lady from South Africa. There's an indigenous Muslim population in South Africa, and she was a Muslim, not from a particularly strict or conservative family, and she was going to a secular university, and she had to write a paper on women in the workplace, right? Pretty generic. And she had always heard that Muhammad had done all these wonderful things for women. So she said, I'm going to write about this, how Muhammad helped women so much. And so she started doing some digging into the actual historical sources, the hadith, all these things. By the way, I'm only citing Muslim sources. I'm not citing people who are non-Muslims talking about Islam. And she actually was just really terrified by what she saw, by what she found. And she said, if that's how the Prophet of Islam, the ideal human being, interacts with women, I don't want to have any part of it, okay? So that was her decision as a young Muslim woman. So what are the options? What can we finally say about Muhammad? Well, I'm not going to tell you my own opinion, but I'll give you the 4 key different verdicts, I guess, that I have found across all the spread of different types of literature about this man's life. And even if you read 100 books, you're probably going to end up with some version of one of these 4. The first one, of course, is the Orthodox Islamic answer that he's inspired by Allah. He's the seal of the prophets, revealing the fullness of God's will for how humans should live, and so on. Second, that he was deceived by the devil. He thought he was talking to Gabriel, but in fact he was talking to another angel, right? Who was posing as Gabriel, but was in fact Satan. The third is that he was psychologically ill. He had some sort of emotional or cerebral problem. And that when he thought he was getting these revelations, he was in fact experiencing seizures and hallucinations and so on. And the fourth one, and I think this is the one that really is just not viable, is a charlatan and a liar, that he was just making this all up as he went along. But really, especially in his early career, he really gave up a lot for the sake of Islam. And usually people don't, once a lie ceases to help you, ceases to enrich you, most people will give it up. But he kept on going. He was very determined. He certainly changed all of history, though, whether you decide that you like him or not. He changed all of history. He founded the Ummah, which launched a massive and rapid series of very successful wars of conquest. Islam has not only spread by the sword, but early on in that first century, that's how it spread. The second, he has the central template for the Sharia. Remember, in this individual life, the entirety of God's will for all humans at all times is revealed. And third, I think that Muslims today are living out the struggle to figure out who this man really was. So you can watch CNN and see Irshad Manji, who was a feminist Muslimah in Canada, talking about how great it is to be a Muslim because he was a feminist and he would vote Democratic and so on. Well, they're in Canada. I think they have different parties. Or you can go and visit Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the Caliph of Islamic State, and he'll give you a different vision of what it means to follow Muhammad and walk in his footsteps. Thank you. Okay, Q&A. And can anyone give me some water, please? I'm kind of thirsty. A cup of water would be great. Okay, questions? Yes. Oh, let's start over here, because I promised you I would start there
That's all right.
earlier
You
on.
can go wherever you want.
Okay, go ahead.
It's not really a question. I introduced myself to you last time.
Yes, thank you, and we're so honored to have you and your companions too.
Here we have more Muslims here.
Wonderful. You are always welcome.
I want to ask that let me just say it like this. You were talking about the Prophet, upon him be peace, his excellence as the perfect man. I agree with you, that is how we see him, but I noticed that you mentioned physical examples. Beard, how he brushed his teeth. In reality, the Quran edifies his inner qualities. And that's what we see. We see the humanness and all of that. So I just wanted to mention that because some of the things he did was cultural in nature, but he's a model for all Muslims regardless of ethnicity, etc. So I just
Thank
wanted
you.
to mention
Thank
that.
you, Imam. Good. So yeah, this is a good point, and thank you for pointing that out. In Islam, many Muslims today, they're not actually going to pay a great deal of attention to how he wore his beard or how he brushed his teeth or whatever. I just mention those because those are usually the things that strike Christians as being particularly different. But certainly, Christians and Muslims would agree on certain virtues of compassion, kindness, generosity to the poor, and that is, of course, part of the Sharia. So the Sharia contains ethical rules in it, but it also contains all of these other things like the banking stuff, sartorial stuff. So I'll tell you a story that I heard once from a guy who had been a missionary in the south of Arabia, and he had gone to the country of Yemen, which is almost entirely Muslim. And there had been a guy there who had been studying the Christian faith with him and was ready to be baptized, which in Yemen is kind of like saying, I'm ready to, meet my maker, right? I'm ready to be killed here. So he was baptized, and then he was, after a while of talking, he was going to go into the bathroom, and he stopped, and he turned to the pastor who had baptized him and said, well, I'm a Christian now. Now what do I say when I walk into the bathroom, right? Because in Islam, he had been taught when you walk into the bathroom, you do it like this, you invoke the name of God like this, and so on and so forth. So again, I'm not trying to overemphasize the importance of these points, but all of this, it's like the Torah. It touches each and every aspect of your life. So Christians, we don't have a political system. If you say, well, what is Jesus like? Well, I think Americans would like to think that Jesus, like to constitutional democratic republic, but you're not going to get that. Sorry. So Christianity can flourish with a king, with an emperor. It can flourish under a socialist system. Don't tell anyone I said that. It can flourish under a libertarian state. It can flourish with a little, city-state in Singapore. Christianity is doing quite well. Or in a big, huge country like, India, where in many areas it's growing quite quickly. So Christianity does not have a system of civil law and a polity built into it. Islam does. So Islam is a religion plus all of this other stuff. Okay, so you had a question, sir? Can you go ahead and say that for everybody so they can hear it?
Me? Yeah. Well, I think you answered it in the course of your lecture, but I'll ask it anyway. The stories about Jesus, his life, his practices, his doctrines, they're all as a result of writings from the people that he selected to be closest to him. The ones that hung around with him for the last 3 years of his life. They are the source of the stories we have about Jesus. Where do the stories about Jesus in the Quran come from?
Where did the stories about Jesus in the Quran come from? Okay, on an academic level, we're getting into really deep waters because even to this day, there are huge discussions about what are the actual sources of the Quran. Historically, there's pre-Arab pagan stuff in there. There are some Christian stories that Muhammad heard from other people, second, third, fourth hand. There is some material in there about Jesus that is not anywhere in the Bible. For example, there's a story that he forms a bird out of clay, breathes onto it, and it flies away. That is from the Proto-Evangelium of St. James, which was used by the Coptic Orthodox Church. So a lot of scholars say, well, presumably he heard that from his Egyptian concubine, Miriam, or Maria. Is it possible? There are some different stories that come from Zoroastrianism in Persia contained in there. There's one single verse of the Quran that is identical to a verse in the Bible. It's in the Psalms. So there's one verse that's identical. A lot of the figures, the main figures, the main people in the Quran are like, Moses and David and Solomon. Some of the stuff overlaps, some of it doesn't. So a lot of different sources. Okay, any other questions? Yes?
What do you think about the new version of the Quran, which has been made now by a Muslim doctor and a Christian?
Mm-hmm.
And they're putting Bible verses at the foot of the page, where there is similarity between the Quran and Bible verses and so forth.
Well, that's not the Quran. The Quran is very unlike the Bible. I mean, metaphysically, using Kenneth Bragg's word, metaphysically, the Quran can only be in Arabic, right? The Quran, even though it's God's revelation for all humanity, and this has always struck me as just a profound weakness of Islam, it lacks the ability to be translated. That's an amazing thing to say about a text, that once you translate it, you no longer actually have the meaning, or you only have the meaning, but it is not the Quran. So as soon as you put that thing into English, it's not the Quran anymore. And whatever you do with footnotes and commentary, yeah, that's fine. I don't care. If you want a good translation of the Quran, I can recommend a few. I like Abdul Halim. I like Dawood. Those are my two preferred ones. Any more questions? Yes.
What do we know that if and what Muhammad knew of the Bible, how familiar he might have been with it and knowledgeable of it?
Yeah, this is a great weakness, right? So the main, and this is you want to answer that?
No.
What did he ask?
Yeah, it wasn't clear what the question was.
Yeah, thank you. So the question is, what did Muhammad know about the Bible, right? Well, we know that Muhammad had extensive relations with different Jews, but again, as I said earlier, he that we know of had just very few direct face-to-face contacts with Christians. What did he know about the Bible? He probably knew.
Read it.
Oh no, he hadn't read it because it had not yet been translated into Arabic. Historically, there are three foundational liturgical languages for the church. The one in the West, what was the one that was used for well over 1,000 years in every church everywhere? What language was that in? Latin, exactly. Biblia Sacra Vulgata, St. Jerome invented a little cave where he translated that thing in Bethlehem, right? I mean, I couldn't do that kind of translation work even with the full staff in a library. He did it in a little cave. Amazing. Okay, so that's Latin. And then what was the main language as you move to what's today the Near East? Are you raising your hand, young lady? Say Greek. Greek. There we go, Greek. And then, as you move further south and further east, the main liturgical language is Syriac. Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic, which is the language that Jesus and the people around him would have spoke on a day-to-day. So when Mary was telling Jesus, go to the market and buy this and that, it would have been in Aramaic, okay? And Syriac is a dialect of that. And that was the language that the Christians in Arabia were using at this time. So they did not yet have the Bible translated into Arabic at that time. Indeed, here's some more kind of recent Quranic scholarship, it's very controversial. One person has suggested that even the very word Quran is simply a cognate of the Syriac word Qur'an, which means the recitation or the prayer book, the book of prayers. So the short answer, though, to your question, what did he know about the Bible? He knew a couple of Old Testament stories, hearsay. At first, he thinks he's going to win the Jews over to his cause by preaching monotheism and not eating pork and facing Jerusalem as the Qibla, the direction that they pray in. But eventually, that becomes clear to him that he's not. We have these verses, kind of like a summary of the discussion in the Quran, where they say, well, Moses gave us bread from heaven. If you're a prophet, give us a miracle. And he's not able to do a miracle right. But he says every verse in this Quran is a miracle from God. I think that's a pretty tall statement. If you're a Muslim and you already believe it, you've always been taught that, it seems self-evident, you know. But if you're not a Muslim and you go and you look at the literature in the Quran, some of it's pretty good stuff, pretty good quality Arabic poetry. Other parts of it are just unintelligible. So, okay, yes.
Is it true that Muhammad was illiterate? Did not read or write?
Is it true that he was illiterate? Yeah. According to Islamic tradition, there's no question about it. This is one of the evidences of his great status, you know, that here is this man who's illiterate, yet he is able to give these incredible, beautiful, powerful verses that incapacitate the person who hears them, and so on and so forth. Historically, we just don't know. We don't know. But according to Islamic orthodoxy, absolutely, he was illiterate. Okay. And it's 8 o'clock, so very good. Thank you very much, and we will get together again next week, unless there's maybe one more question? One more question? No? Okay, go
I was
ahead.
just going to, back to the gentleman's comment about the Bible and what Muhammad might have known. When we refer to the Bible, it's both New and Old Testament. So, and the canon of the Bible, what we know of the Bible, wouldn't come into existence for another 500 years after his death, after Muhammad's death. So there's no way that he could have known anything about Christianity unless he had visited one of the churches and heard the memoirs of the apostles.
Well, I'll give you a quick chronology. I would suggest you come to Sunday school at another church that I'm doing, which is on the formation of the New Testament canon. But I know you have a good church and you're the music guy, so I don't listen to it in my blog, duanemiller.wordpress.com. I'll put the audio on there for you. What's our timeline? Okay, circa 33 AD, the church is born, Pentecost, this kind of obscure Jewish sect that goes on to become 33% of the worldwide population. Okay, when's the formation of the New Testament canon finished? Like, by what time do we have, is it 27 books, is that right, in the New Testament canon? By what time do we have precisely those books present and being used everywhere? By the late 300s. Okay. Later on, we have the definitions of the key doctrines of Christianity: the Trinity, the Incarnation, the Atonement. All of that is in place by the year 500. Muhammad is born around 570. Okay. So that's kind of the chronology at this point. But yeah, but there is no Bible in Arabic yet. And indeed, by the time of Muhammad, even most churches probably still have an assortment of different scrolls. The idea of putting this all into one codex is that doesn't become common until the medieval period, so a bit later. Okay, thank you very much.